Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I never imagined my life would turn into a nightmare of paranoia and fear, but here I am. It all started about 6 months ago when I was just an ordinary IT guy working for a small government contractor. My job was simple: maintaining servers, updating software, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. I was good at it, and I liked the routine. One day, I was called in to assist with a project for a higher-up division. They needed some quick help migrating data, and I was available. The task itself was straightforward, just a lot of data transfer between servers. But as I was working through the files, I stumbled upon a folder labeled Project Anomaly. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. What I found inside changed everything. There were documents, photos, and videos, files that detailed interactions with extraterrestrial beings, real undeniable proof of alien life. The documents talked about secret meetings, crashed UFOs, and genetic experiments on humans. The video showed these creatures pale and humanoid, but with disturbingly large eyes and elongated limbs. They looked like something out of a nightmare. The most chilling part was the experiments. There were detailed records of abductions, surgical procedures, and tests being performed on people. Ordinary people, just snatched from their daily lives and subjected to horrifying experiments. One file was a video of a woman strapped to a table, screaming as these beings cut into her. They didn't use anesthesia. She was fully conscious, writhing in pain as they probed her insides. I had to stop the video. It was too much. I should have reported it. I should have closed the folder and pretended I saw nothing, but I didn't. I copied everything onto a USB drive. I thought the world needed to know. I thought I could expose the truth and become some kind of hero. I was so naive. The next day, I went back to work like everything was normal. But things were different. People started looking at me weird. I noticed black SUVs parked near my apartment. My phone acted strange, calls dropping, weird static, messages disappearing. I shrugged it off as paranoia, until they came for me. It was late, maybe 2 a.m., and I was jolted awake by a loud bang on my door. Before I could react, they were inside, men in black suits, armed and serious. They didn't say a word. They grabbed me, dragged me out of bed, and threw me into one of those black SUVs. I was blindfolded and driven for what felt like hours. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I knew I was in deep trouble. When the blindfold came off, I was in a cold, sterile room. There was a metal table and a single chair. I was shoved into the chair, and then they started questioning me. They knew everything, who I was, what I did, what I saw. They wanted to know who else knew. I lied, said it was just me. They didn't believe me. The next part is a blur of pain and fear. They tortured me, trying to get me to talk. Electric shocks, beatings, waterboarding. They did everything to break me, but I held on. I didn't tell them about the USB drive. After what felt like days, they must have realized I wasn't going to crack. They left me in that room, broken and bloody, and I thought I was going to die there. But then they let me go, just like that. They dumped me back near my apartment, warned me to forget everything, and disappeared. I was terrified, but I still had the USB drive. I needed to get the information out, but I didn't know how. I couldn't trust anyone. I was being watched. That's when I started posting here, on Reddit, anonymously at first, trying to find someone who believed me, who could help me. But I was too paranoid to share everything. I just hinted at it, hoping someone would reach out. And someone did. This guy, let's call him John, claimed to be an ex-government hacker. He said he could help me expose the truth, but we needed to meet in person. I was desperate, so I agreed. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in a different town, far from my apartment. I took every precaution, different routes, public transport, disguises. When I got there, John was already waiting. He looked normal, but there was something off about him. We exchanged pleasantries, then he got straight to the point. He wanted the USB drive. I hesitated, but eventually handed it over. He plugged it into his laptop, and that's when everything went to hell. His laptop started smoking, then exploded. John jumped up, his face contorted in anger and fear. "You led them to us," he shouted. Before I could react, the coffee shop was swarming with the agents. They grabbed John and me, and the last thing I remember is a sharp pain in my neck and everything going black. I woke up in a different room, strapped to a table. The lights were bright, and there was a constant hum. A man in a lab coat stood over me, smiling. He said they were going to make sure I forgot everything, make sure I was no longer a threat. I struggled, screamed, but it was no use. They injected me with something, and I felt my consciousness slipping away. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was back in my apartment. Everything seemed normal, but I knew it wasn't. I had these flashes of memory, of the torture, the experiments, the aliens. I checked my computer, and the USB drive was gone. All the evidence, everything I risked my life for, gone. I tried to reach out to John, but he disappeared. His phone was disconnected, and his apartment was empty. It was like he never existed. I knew I was alone. Now, I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for them to come back. I don't sleep much. I keep a baseball bat by my bed, but I know it won't do much good. They can get me anytime they want. Since my last post, things have only gotten worse. I know they're still watching me. I can feel it every second of every day. I've taken to staying in crowded places, thinking they wouldn't dare do anything out in the open, but it's not enough to make me feel safe. One night, I was sitting in a dingy bar downtown, nursing a drink and trying to make sense of everything that happened. I kept replaying the events in my head, wondering if there was something I missed, some clue or way out of this nightmare. That's when I saw him, the same guy in a black suit who first grabbed me from my apartment. He walked in and sat a few tables away, not even trying to hide his presence. He wanted me to know he was there. I panicked, paid my tab, and left in a hurry. I could hear footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I ran through alleyways, crossed streets randomly, hoping to lose him. I ended up in an old, abandoned warehouse district. It was a mistake. The place was eerily quiet, just the sound of my ragged breathing and distant sirens. I found a spot to hide behind some crates and tried to collect myself. That's when I heard the voices, whispering but clear. They were talking about me. They can't know he's still alive. Do we finish him here? Orders are to bring him in. He's too valuable. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. But they did. One of them grabbed me by the collar and threw me against a wall. My vision blurred from the impact, but I could make out their faces, cold, emotionless, like they'd done this 1,000 times before. I struggled, kicked, but they were too strong. "Where's the drive?" one of them demanded. I spat at him, which earned me a punch in the gut. I doubled over, gasping for air. They weren't playing around this time. "We know you made copies," another one said. "Where are they?" I didn't have any copies. The only drive was the one John had, and it was destroyed. But they didn't believe me. They dragged me deeper into the warehouse, into a makeshift interrogation room. Metal chair, single light bulb, just like before. They tied me to the chair and started the process all over again. Beatings, electric shocks, waterboarding. The pain was unbearable, but I couldn't give them what they wanted because I didn't have it. I kept blacking out, only to be jolted awake by more pain. At some point, they stopped. I was left alone, drenched, shivering, barely conscious. I thought it was over, but then the real horror began. I saw them, the aliens. They walked in, their movements smooth and almost hypnotic. Those large black eyes stared into mine as if they could see right through me. They didn't speak, but I could hear them in my head, whispering, probing my thoughts. It felt like my brain was being torn apart. Images flashed before my eyes, memories I didn't even know I had. They showed me their world, dark, cold, and sterile. They showed me humans, hundreds of them, kept in pods, experimented on like lab rats. I could feel their pain, their fear. It was overwhelming. And then they showed me something else. A face. My face. They had taken me before, more than once. They had erased my memories each time, but the trauma remained, buried deep in my subconscious. They were trying to break me, to see if I remembered anything useful. I screamed, or at least I tried to. My voice was gone, my throat raw from the torture. The aliens kept probing, and I felt myself slipping away. My mind was shattering under the pressure. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, they stopped. The room was silent. I was alone again. Hours passed, or maybe days. I lost track of time. Eventually, the men in black suits returned. They untied me, dragged me outside, and threw me into the back of another SUV. This time, they didn't blindfold me. I saw the city passing by, familiar landmarks blurring into the distance. We stopped at an old motel on the outskirts of the town. They threw me out, handed me a key, and drove off without a word. I stumbled into the motel room, collapsed onto the bed, and passed out. When I woke up, it was morning. My body ached, but I was alive. I checked my phone. Dozens of missed calls and messages from friends and family. I had been gone for 3 days. I knew I couldn't go back to my apartment. It wasn't safe. I needed help, but I couldn't trust anyone. I remembered an old friend from college, a conspiracy theorist, who always talked about government cover-ups and alien encounters. I used to think he was crazy, but now he was my only hope. I made my way to his place, trying to stay out of sight. When I got there, he welcomed me with open arms. I told him everything, showed him the scars, the bruises, the video evidence I had managed to save on my phone. He believed me. We spent the next few days planning. He had connections, people who could help us get the information out safely. But we had to be careful. We knew they were watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. One night, we were going over our plan when his phone rang. He answered, and his face went pale. He hung up and looked at me, terrified. "They know where we are," he said. "We have to leave. Now." We grabbed what we could and bolted out the door. As we ran through the dark streets, I heard the familiar sound of black SUVs closing in. My heart raced. They were right behind us. We needed to disappear, to go off the grid completely. but deep down, I knew there was no escaping them. I'm posting this from a burner phone, somewhere far from home. I don't know how long I have before they find me again, but I have to keep trying. The truth is out there, and people need to know. Living off the grid is harder than I thought. My friend, let's call him Dave, and I've been moving from place to place, staying in rundown motels, abandoned buildings, anywhere we can avoid detection. We've learned to live without modern conveniences, relying on burner phones, cash-only transactions, and the kindness of strangers who are willing to help. No questions asked. It's not much of a life, but it's all we've got. Every time I hear a car pull up or a door creak open, my heart skips a beat. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting those men in black suits to burst in at any moment. The paranoia is suffocating. I've developed a nervous twitch, and sleep is a distant memory. Dave says I look like a ghost of my former self, but he's no better off. The stress is eating away at us both. One night, we were holed up in an abandoned farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It was a cold, damp place, but it offered some semblance of shelter. We had just settled in, planning our next move, when we heard it. A low hum, like a distant generator. It grew louder, closer. Dave and I exchanged a look of pure terror. We knew what that sound meant. "They're here," Dave whispered, his face pale. We scrambled to gather our things, but it was too late. The lights in the farmhouse flickered, then went out completely. We were plunged into darkness. I could hear Dave's ragged breathing next to me, could feel my own heart pounding in my chest. We needed to get out, but there was nowhere to go. A bright light filled the room, blinding us. I shielded my eyes, trying to see through the glare. And then I saw them, the aliens. They floated towards us, their large black eyes reflecting the light. Their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I felt an invisible force pressing down on me, pinning me in place. Dave tried to run, but he didn't get far. One of the aliens raised a hand, and Dave was lifted off the ground, suspended in mid-air. He screamed, thrashing wildly, but there was nothing he could do. The alien's eyes glowed, and Dave went silent. He hung there, limp, like a puppet with its strings cut. I tried to move, to help him, but my body wouldn't respond. The aliens turned their gaze on me, and I felt my mind unraveling. Images flashed before my eyes, memories of my life, of the people I loved, twisted and distorted. I saw my parents, their faces twisted in pain. I saw friends, their eyes hollow and lifeless. It was like they were feeding off my fear, my pain. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, the light disappeared. The aliens were gone, and I was alone in the dark farmhouse. Dave was lying on the floor, unmoving. I crawled over to him, my limbs heavy and uncooperative. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow, his eyes unfocused. "We need to go," I whispered, trying to shake him awake. "Dave, we need to move." He didn't respond. I managed to get him onto his feet, and we stumbled out of the farmhouse into the cold night air. I don't know how we made it, but we found an old truck parked nearby. The keys were still in the ignition. It felt like a miracle, but I knew better. Nothing about our situation was a coincidence. We drove for hours, not caring where we were going, as long as it was away from there. Dave was in bad shape. He mumbled incoherently, his eyes darting around like he was seeing things that weren't there. I knew he needed a hospital, but it was too risky. We couldn't trust anyone. We ended up in another small town, found a cheap motel, and I did my best to patch Dave up. His condition was getting worse. He had these strange marks on his skin, like burn scars, but they glowed faintly in the dark. He muttered about the aliens, about the things they did to him. I tried to calm him down, but he was beyond comforting. One night, Dave woke up screaming. He was clawing at his own skin, trying to tear off the marks. I had to restrain him, hold him down until he exhausted himself. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of terror and desperation. "They're inside me," he whispered. "I can feel them. They're controlling me." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to reassure him, tell him it was all in his head, but I couldn't. I had seen too much, experienced too much, to dismiss his fears. I could feel the same thing sometimes, a cold, invasive presence in my mind, like someone was watching through my eyes. We couldn't stay in one place for long. Dave was getting worse, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they found us again. We needed help, but there was no one to turn to. Every contact, every ally we tried to reach out to ended up disappearing or turning against us. It was like we were cursed. One day, Dave couldn't get out of bed. He was burning up with fever, delirious and raving about the aliens, about experiments and control. I was at my wit's end. I knew we couldn't keep going like this. I had to do something, anything, to save him. Desperation led me to a dark corner of the internet, to forums and chat rooms where people shared stories of encounters, of abductions, and conspiracies. Most of it was nonsense, but there were a few who seemed to know what they were talking about. I found a user who went by the name Watcher. He claimed to have inside knowledge, to have been part of the same project that had ruined my life. I contacted him, told him everything. Watcher was cautious, but he seemed genuinely interested in helping. He said he knew a place, a safe house, where we could hide and get the help we needed. It was risky, but we had no other options. We made plans to meet in a remote location, far from any prying eyes. The journey was harrowing. Dave was barely coherent, and I had to carry him most of the way. We avoided main roads, stuck to the wilderness, moving only at night. I was exhausted, but the thought of finally finding safety kept me going. We reached the meeting point, an old cabin deep in the woods. Watcher was waiting for us, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and wary eyes. He took one look at Dave and shook his head. "He doesn't have much time," Watcher said. "We need to get him inside, now." We carried Dave into the cabin, laid him on a makeshift bed. Watcher had a small lab set up with strange devices and equipment I didn't recognize. He worked quickly, injecting Dave with something, attaching monitors to his chest. "What are you doing?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Trying to save him," Watcher replied, his voice grim. "But I can't make any promises. They've done a number on him." I watched, helpless, as Watcher worked. Hours passed, and Dave's condition didn't improve. I felt a cold dread settle over me, the realization that this might be the end for him, for both of us. Watcher pulled me aside, his expression serious. "They're not just watching you," he said. "They're tracking you. You need to stay off the grid completely. No phones, no internet, nothing. If they find you here, it's over." I nodded, my throat tight. "What about Dave?" "We'll do what we can," Watcher said. "But you need to be prepared. This fight isn't over, and it's going to get worse." I knew he was right. The aliens, the government, whoever was behind this, they weren't going to stop. And now, more than ever, I had to find a way to expose the truth. But first, I had to survive. Dave didn't make it through the night. Despite Watcher's efforts, his body finally gave in to whatever the aliens had done to him. I sat by his side as he took his last breath, feeling a mix of sorrow and rage. I had lost a friend, and I was more determined than ever to uncover the truth and expose those responsible. Watcher was a lifeline. He knew the ins and outs of the government's cover-ups and had the skills to help me navigate the dangerous path ahead. We burned Dave's body, a necessary precaution to prevent any tracking or further contamination. The smell of burning flesh haunted me for days, but it was a grim necessity. Our first priority was to disappear completely. We ditched the truck and moved deeper into the wilderness, hiking for days until we reached another safe house. This one even more isolated than the cabin. It was a small bunker, well stocked with supplies and equipped with everything we needed to stay hidden for a while. Watcher and I spent weeks in that bunker, planning our next move. He showed me how to secure communications, how to avoid surveillance, and how to live off the grid effectively. The paranoia never left, but I was getting better at managing it. I was becoming a ghost, just like them. One night, as we sat in the dim light of the bunker, Watcher revealed something that sent chills down my spine. He had managed to decrypt some of the files I had copied onto the USB drive before it was destroyed. Among the data were detailed reports of ongoing experiments and surveillance projects. They're not just observing, Watcher said, his voice tense. They're preparing for something. These experiments, they're creating hybrids, combining human and alien DNA. I felt a wave of nausea. The implications were horrifying. Why? What's the end game? I don't know, Watcher admitted. But whatever it is, it's big. They're building an army, or maybe they're planning to replace us. We need to get this information out, but we have to be smart about it. We devised a plan to leak the information to the public. It wasn't going to be easy. We needed to find trustworthy journalists, secure anonymous channels, and ensure the data couldn't be traced back to us. Every step was a potential risk, but it was our only option. Weeks turned into months. We moved frequently, never staying in one place for too long. The paranoia was a constant companion, but we were making progress. Slowly, we started to reach out to contacts, people who might be willing to help without asking too many questions. One night, we got a break. A journalist known for exposing government corruption and cover-ups agreed to meet us. We arranged a meeting in a remote location, taking every precaution to avoid being followed. Watcher and I were on edge the entire time, but we had to take the chance. The meeting went smoothly. The journalist was skeptical at first, but once we showed him the decrypted files, his expression changed. He knew this was big, bigger than anything he'd ever covered. He agreed to help us, to get the story out in a way that would be impossible to suppress. We handed over the files, watching as the journalist carefully packed them away. It was a moment of relief, knowing the truth was finally going to be revealed. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The real battle was just beginning. A few days later, the story broke. It was all over the news. Headlines about government conspiracies, alien experiments, and secret projects. The world was in shock, and the government was scrambling to contain the fallout. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was short-lived. One night, as Watcher and I were preparing to move to another safe house, we heard it. The low hum growing louder. We knew what it meant. We grabbed our things and bolted, but it was too late. The lights in the bunker flickered and went out. The aliens were here. They descended on us with terrifying speed. I felt the familiar pressure in my head, the invasive presence probing my thoughts. Watcher tried to fight them off, but he was no match. They lifted him into the air, just like they had with Dave. His screams echoed through the bunker, chilling me to the bone. I ran, desperate to escape, but there was nowhere to go. They cornered me, their black eyes staring into mine. I could feel them in my mind, searching, probing. The pain was unbearable. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, trying to resist. And then, everything went black. I woke up in a sterile room, strapped to a table. The familiar hum of machinery filled the air. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. Panic set in. I knew what was coming. The door opened, and a figure stepped inside. It was one of the men in black suits, his face expressionless. He walked over to me, looking down with a mix of pity and cold detachment. "You should have stayed quiet," he said. "Now, it's too late." I tried to speak, to ask what they were going to do to me, but no words came out. The man in the suit nodded to someone behind him, and the aliens entered the room. They surrounded me, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. The pain started again, worse than before. I could feel them inside my mind, tearing it apart. Memories flashed before my eyes, my family, my friends, everything I had ever known and loved. They were erasing me, piece by piece. As I lay there, helpless and broken, a single thought kept repeating in my mind. The truth is out there. People know. They can't erase all of us. The light grew brighter, the pain more intense. And then, just before everything went dark, I saw it. A vision of a world, our world, but changed. The aliens were everywhere, walking among us, indistinguishable from humans. They had won. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was back in my apartment. Everything seemed normal, but I knew it wasn't. My mind was a fog, my memories fragmented. They had done something to me, something irreversible. I checked the news, and the story was gone, erased, just like everything else. The world had moved on, oblivious to the truth. I was alone, broken, and silenced. But even in my fractured state, I knew one thing. I had to keep fighting. The truth was out there, and I couldn't let them win. I don't know how much time I have left, or if I'll ever be the same again, but I'll keep trying. For Dave, for Watcher, for everyone who's been silenced. If you're reading this, remember, they're real, they're watching, and they won't stop. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and never stop searching for the truth. I found government surveillance, documents on the dark web, and now I'm being followed. Hey, Reddit, I don't usually post stuff like this, but I have to get it out there. Maybe someone can help me, or at least tell me I'm not crazy. Here's the thing. I found some government surveillance documents on the dark web, and now I'm being followed. I know how it sounds, but just hear me out. It started a few months ago. I've always been a bit of a tech geek, and I dabble in the dark web from time to time. Nothing major, just out of curiosity mostly. One night, I was browsing some forums, and I came across this post titled, "Top Secret Government Files, Download Now." Obviously, I was skeptical. It screamed scam or trap, but my curiosity got the better of me. The download was a huge zip file, and it took forever to complete. When I finally opened it, I found thousands of documents, videos, and images. It was a goldmine of classified information. There were surveillance reports, photos of people taken without their knowledge, and even transcripts of private conversations. As I started going through it, I felt this growing sense of dread. I knew I was in way over my head, but I couldn't stop. One document stood out to me. It was labeled Operation Deep Eye. It detailed a secret government program where they used advanced surveillance technology to monitor citizens 24/7. They had access to every camera, microphone, and electronic device. They knew everything about everyone. There were lists of names, and I recognized some of them. Local politicians, businessmen, even some people I knew personally. I should have stopped there. I should have deleted everything and pretended I never saw it. But I didn't. I kept digging, and that's when things got really messed up. There were video files showing people being followed, harassed, even abducted. They were taken to these secret facilities and never seen again. The footage was grainy, but the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. Then I found a folder with my name on it. Inside were photos of me, at work, at home, at the grocery store. There were recordings of my phone calls, screenshots of my texts, and detailed logs of my internet activity. They knew everything about me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I slammed my laptop shut and tried to calm down, but my mind was racing. How long had they been watching me? Why? I had so many questions, but no answers. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those images. The next morning, I decided to go to the police. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to try. I grabbed my laptop and headed out. As I was leaving my apartment, I noticed a black SUV parked across the street. I didn't think much of it at the time. My neighborhood isn't exactly the safest, so seeing random cars wasn't unusual. The police station was a nightmare. They didn't believe me, of course. The officer I spoke to looked at me like I was crazy and told me to go home. "Stop wasting our time," he said. Frustrated, I left and decided to head back home and figure out my next move. That's when I saw the SUV again, this time parked a few blocks from the station. Okay, now I was officially freaked out. I started walking faster, constantly looking over my shoulder. The SUV was following me. I could feel the panic rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. I took a few random turns, trying to lose them, but they were always there, just out of sight. When I finally got home, I bolted the door and pulled all the curtains closed. My hands were shaking as I tried to think of what to do next. I decided to reach out to some friends who are more tech savvy than I am. Maybe they could help me make sense of the files and figure out who was behind all this. I sent a few texts and waited, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every noise made me jump, and I was constantly checking my phone. A few hours later, my phone rang. It was my friend Mark, a guy I knew from college who worked in cybersecurity. I quickly filled him in, and he agreed to come over and take a look. When he arrived, I showed him the files. He was as shocked as I was. "This is some serious shit," he said, scrolling through the documents. "We need to be careful. If they know we're looking at this, we could be in real trouble." We spent the next few hours trying to piece things together. Mark was able to trace some of the IP addresses in the files, and they all led back to government servers. This was no hoax. It was real. The more we dug, the more paranoid I became. Every sound outside, every car passing by felt like a threat. Then Mark found something that made my blood run cold. "Dude, you need to see this," he said. his face pale. He showed me a document that was recently updated just a few hours ago. It was a surveillance log, and the most recent entry was about me. It said I had discovered the files and that I was a target of interest. They were coming for me. We both freaked out. Mark grabbed his stuff and said he needed to go home and do some more research. He promised to keep in touch and let me know if he found anything useful. After he left, I felt even more alone. I kept thinking about those videos, the people being taken. Was that going to happen to me? The next few days were a blur. I barely ate, barely slept. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every little noise. The SUV was always there, parked somewhere nearby. I stopped going out, afraid of what might happen. My friends and family noticed something was wrong, but I couldn't tell them. I didn't want to put them in danger too. Then one night, things took a turn for the worse. I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with some TV, when I heard a noise outside. It was a soft tapping, like someone was at my window. My heart stopped. I grabbed a kitchen knife and slowly made my way to the window. I peeked through the curtains and saw a shadowy figure standing just outside. I froze, my mind racing. Should I call the police? What if they didn't believe me again? What if they were in on it? As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, the tapping stopped. The figure moved away, disappearing into the night. I locked all the doors and windows and sat in the middle of the room, clutching the knife. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. It was a simple piece of paper with a single word written on it. Stop. That was it. No explanation, no signature. Just stop. I knew what it meant. They wanted me to stop digging, to stop looking at the files. But it was too late for that. I was in too deep, and I had to find a way out. I called Mark, but he didn't answer. I tried again and again, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Panic set in. What if something had happened to him? What if they had gotten to him already? I felt like I was losing my mind. I couldn't trust anyone, couldn't go to the authorities. I was completely alone. I decided to pack a bag and get out of town for a while. Maybe if I laid low, they would lose interest in me. I grabbed some clothes, my laptop, and whatever cash I had on hand. As I was leaving, I noticed the SUV again, parked a few houses down. They were watching me. I took a deep breath and started walking, trying to act casual. I made it to the bus station without incident. As I was waiting for the bus, I saw a man in a dark suit watching me from across the street. He didn't do anything, just stood there, staring. My skin crawled. When the bus finally arrived, I practically ran on board. I took a seat at the back and watched as the man disappeared from view. The bus ride was long and tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached my destination, a small town a few hours away, I checked into a cheap motel and tried to gather my thoughts. I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down. Not yet. That night, I got an email from Mark. The subject line read, "Urgent, read now." My hands were shaking as I opened it. The message was short and to the point. "They're onto us. I found something big. Meet me at the old factory outside town tomorrow night. Come alone. Mark." I didn't know what to think. Was it a trap? Had they forced Mark to send it? But I didn't have much choice. If there was even a chance that Mark had found something that could help us, I had to go. I spent the rest of the night planning my next move. trying to stay calm. Tomorrow, I would find out the truth, one way or another. The next day felt like an eternity. I stayed holed up in my motel room, jumping at every sound, every footstep outside my door. I knew I had to go meet Mark, but the fear of walking into a trap was overwhelming. I spent hours pacing the room, checking my phone, and going over the plan in my head. As the sun began to set, I made my way to the old factory Mark had mentioned. It was a decrepit, abandoned building on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one would hear you scream. I arrived early, hiding in the shadows, watching for any sign of movement. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle of leaves or distant bark of a dog made my heart race. Finally, I saw him. Mark emerged from the darkness, looking as paranoid and haggard as I felt. He glanced around nervously before making his way to the side entrance of the factory. I waited a few minutes, ensuring he was alone, before following. Inside the factory was a maze of rusted machinery and broken windows. Mark was waiting in what used to be the main office, a small room littered with old papers and debris. His eyes widened when he saw me, and he hurried me inside, locking the door behind us. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "I found out what they're doing, and it's worse than we thought." He handed me a flash drive. "Everything's on here. The surveillance, the experiments, the disappearances. They have plans, man. Big plans. And we're smack in the middle of it." I plugged the drive into my laptop and started scrolling through the files. There were detailed reports of surveillance operations, just like the ones I'd seen before. But this time, there were also files on subjects, people they had taken. There were medical reports, psychological evaluations, and even videos of experiments being conducted. It was sickening. "They're using us," Mark continued. "They've been watching us for years, studying us, and now they're starting to take people, the ones who know too much, who dig too deep. They perform these experiments on them, trying to control them, to make them disappear without a trace." I felt my stomach churn as I watched one of the videos. A man was strapped to a table, screaming as men in lab coats injected him with something. His body convulsed, and then he went still. The camera zoomed in on his face, eyes wide open, staring blankly. He was dead. "They're using some kind of chemical to erase memories, to control minds," Mark said. "Anyone who gets too close to the truth gets taken. We need to expose this, but we have to be careful. They're watching us." Suddenly, we heard a noise outside the office. Footsteps, getting closer. Mark's eyes widened in panic. "They found us. We need to go. Now." We bolted out of the office and ran through the factory, the sound of footsteps echoing behind us. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it would burst. We made it to a side door and slipped out into the night, but the danger was far from over. As we ran through the dark, abandoned streets, I could hear the sound of engines revving. I glanced back and saw two black SUVs speeding towards us. My mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline. We needed to find a place to hide, but we were in the middle of nowhere. Mark grabbed my arm and pulled me towards an old rundown house at the end of the street. We crashed through the door and hid in the basement, trying to catch our breath. The sound of the SUVs grew louder, then stopped. They were right outside. "We can't stay here," I whispered. "They'll find us." Mark nodded, his face pale and sweaty. "We need to get to the next town, find somewhere safe." We waited until the sound of footsteps outside faded, then made our move. We slipped out through a back window and ran through the dark, empty streets, trying to stay out of sight. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound like a sign that they were right behind us. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the next town. We found a small, dingy motel and checked in under fake names. Once we were safely inside the room, I collapsed on the bed, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. "We need to get this information out there," I said, "but how? They'll be watching everything." Mark nodded. "I have a contact in the media, someone I trust. We can send the files to them, but we need to be careful. If they trace it back to us, we're dead." The next morning, Mark made the call. He spoke in hushed tones, explaining the situation to his contact. They agreed to meet us later that day at a nearby diner. We spent the rest of the morning nervously watching the clock, waiting for the time to come. When we arrived at the diner, I felt a surge of paranoia. Every person, every car felt like a potential threat. Mark's contact was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened intently as we explained everything, her face growing graver with each passing minute. "This is huge," she said finally. "If what you're saying is true, this could blow the lid off the whole operation, but you need to be careful. These people don't mess around. If they know you're onto them, they'll come after you." We handed her the flash drive and watched as she left, praying that she would be able to get the information out there. As we walked back to the motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every car that passed made me jump. Every person we walked by felt like a threat. That night, I barely slept. I kept my laptop open, refreshing news sites, waiting for something to break. But nothing came. The silence was suffocating. Around 3 a.m., I heard a noise outside our room. A soft, almost imperceptible rustling. I froze, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, and then I saw the shadow under the door. Someone was out there. I shook Mark awake, my heart pounding in my chest. "Someone's here," I whispered. He grabbed the knife from the nightstand and motioned for me to stay quiet. We waited, breathless, as the doorknob slowly began to turn. The door creaked open, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. A figure stepped into the room, silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on us. Mark lunged forward, the knife raised, but the figure moved faster. There was a flash of movement, and Mark collapsed to the ground, blood pooling around him. I screamed and scrambled back, but the figure grabbed me, their grip like iron. "You should have listened," a voice hissed in my ear. "Now it's too late." The last thing I remember was a sharp pain in my neck, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a small, sterile room. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed softly, and the smell of antiseptic filled the air. I tried to move, but my hands and feet were strapped to a cold metal table. Panic surged through me as I struggled against the restraints, but it was no use. I was trapped. The door creaked open, and 2 men in lab coats walked in. One of them was carrying a clipboard, the other a syringe. My heart pounded as they approached. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The man with the clipboard ignored my question, flipping through some papers instead. The other man, the one with the syringe, gave me a chilling smile. "Just relax," he said. "This won't take long." I thrashed against the restraints, trying to get free, but the straps were too tight. The man with the syringe grabbed my arm and injected me with something. A burning sensation spread through my veins, and my vision started to blur. As the drug took effect, I could hear the men talking, their voices distant and echoey. "Subject 47, one of them said. "He's been compromised. We need to proceed with the memory wipe and behavioral reconditioning." I tried to scream, but my mouth wouldn't cooperate. My body felt heavy, my mind foggy. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the ceiling spinning above me. When I woke up again, I was in a different room. This one was smaller, darker. There were no windows, just a single door, and a camera mounted in the corner. I sat up slowly, my head pounding. My hands were free, but I could feel the marks from the restraints digging into my skin. I tried to piece together what had happened, but my memories were hazy. I remembered the files, the factory, the diner, but everything after that was a blur. I stumbled to the door and tried the handle, but it was locked. Panic set in as I realized I was completely alone. Days passed, maybe weeks. I had no way of knowing. The only contact I had with anyone was when the door would open and a tray of food would be shoved inside. I screamed and begged for answers, but no one ever responded. One day, the door finally opened, and a man I hadn't seen before walked in. He was tall, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. He looked at me like I was an insect he was about to crush. "You're awake," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice cracking from disuse. The man smirked. "My name is Dr. Caldwell. You, my friend, are part of a very important experiment. You stumbled upon some information you shouldn't have, and now we need to ensure that you won't be a problem." "What did you do to me?" I asked, my mind racing. "We're simply going to help you forget," Dr. Caldwell replied. "And then we'll recondition you to be more cooperative." My blood ran cold. "You can't do this. People will know I'm missing. My friends, my family. Your friends and family think you're dead," he interrupted. "We made sure of that. As far as the world is concerned, you no longer exist." The room spun around me as the weight of his words sank in. I was completely alone, with no hope of rescue. Dr. Caldwell turned to leave, but paused at the door. "We'll begin the procedures tomorrow. I suggest you get some rest." The door slammed shut, leaving me in darkness. I felt a wave of despair crash over me. I was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no way out. That night, I lay on the cold, hard floor, trying to make sense of everything. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I had to find a way to escape, but how? I was locked in a room with no windows, no tools, and no idea where I was. The next morning, the door opened again, and 2 guards dragged me out of the room. They took me down a long, dimly lit hallway to a large laboratory. The room was filled with strange equipment and monitors, displaying streams of data. In the center of the room was a metal chair with straps and electrodes. Dr. Caldwell was waiting for me, a clipboard in hand. "Good morning," he said cheerfully. "I trust you slept well." I glared at him, refusing to respond. The guards forced me into the chair and strapped me down. Dr. Caldwell approached with a syringe and a cold smile. "This will help you relax," he said, injecting me with a clear liquid. The drug took effect almost immediately, and I felt my muscles go limp. My mind started to fog, and I could barely keep my eyes open. Dr. Caldwell attached electrodes to my temples and began adjusting the machinery. "We're going to start with a simple memory wipe, he explained. This will erase any knowledge of the files you accessed and your involvement in this project. After that, we'll move on to the reconditioning. As he spoke, I felt a strange sensation in my head, like a gentle buzzing. My thoughts became muddled, and I struggled to hold on to my memories. I could feel them slipping away, one by one. The faces of my friends and family blurred, and the events of the past few months faded into darkness. Just as I was about to lose consciousness, I heard a loud crash. My eyes snapped open, and I saw Mark standing in the doorway, holding a metal pipe. His face was bruised and bloodied, but he had a fierce determination in his eyes. "Let him go," Mark shouted, swinging the pipe at one of the guards. The guard went down, and Mark turned to Dr. Caldwell. "I said, let him go." Dr. Caldwell raised his hands in surrender, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "This is a mistake," he said. "You don't know what you're doing." Mark ignored him and rushed over to me, unstrapping the electrodes and helping me out of the chair. "Come on, we need to get out of here," he said urgently. I stumbled to my feet, still groggy from the drugs. Mark supported me as we made our way out of the lab and down the hallway. Alarms blared, and I could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. "We're not going to make it," I said, my voice weak. "Yes, we are," Mark replied, his grip tightening on my arm. "We have to." We burst through a door at the end of the hallway and found ourselves in a dimly lit garage. Mark led me to a car parked in the corner and shoved me into the passenger seat. He jumped in the driver's seat and started the engine, speeding out of the garage just as the guards reached us. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the facility fading into the distance. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear, but one thing was clear. I owed Mark my life. We drove for hours, putting as much distance between us and the facility as possible. Eventually, we pulled over at a rest stop, and Mark turned to me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes filled with concern. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. "How did you find me?" I asked. "After they took you, I went underground," he explained. "I knew they would be looking for me, so I had to be careful. But I couldn't just leave you there. I spent weeks tracking down the facility and planning your escape." "Thank you," I said, my voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Mark smiled, but it was a sad, weary smile. "We're not out of the woods yet. They won't stop looking for us. We need to stay off the grid, keep moving." I nodded, knowing he was right. Our lives had been irrevocably changed, and we could never go back to the way things were. But for now, we had each other, and that was enough. As we drove into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The files, the experiments, the people who had disappeared. There were still so many unanswered questions, and I knew that as long as we were alive, we would never stop searching for the truth. The next few weeks were a blur of cheap motels, back roads, and constant paranoia. Mark and I stayed off the grid as much as possible, using cash for everything, avoiding cameras, and always checking our surroundings. We changed cars several times, each one more beat up than the last, to throw off anyone who might be tracking us. Every night, we'd take turns keeping watch, our eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Sleep was scarce and fleeting, and the stress was taking its toll on both of us. Mark's bruises from his daring rescue had healed, but the exhaustion was etched deeply into his face. One night, we were holed up in a seedy motel just outside a small town in the middle of nowhere. Mark was on his laptop, scouring the dark web for any information that could help us, while I was staring blankly at the flickering TV, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Suddenly, Mark let out a low whistle. "Hey, come look at this," he said, waving me over. I joined him at the small table where his laptop was set up. On the screen was a message board post from someone claiming to have insider information about Operation Deep Eye. The post was cryptic but hinted at a massive cover-up and provided coordinates to a location in the mountains where evidence was supposedly hidden. "This could be it," Mark said, his eyes gleaming with a mix of hope and fear. "If we can get to that location, we might find something that can blow this whole thing wide open." It was a long shot, and we both knew it could be a trap, but we were out of options. We packed our bags and left the motel under the cover of darkness, heading towards the mountains. The drive was tense and silent, the weight of our decision hanging heavily in the air. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the roads became narrower and more treacherous. Finally, we reached the coordinates, a remote, abandoned cabin hidden deep in the woods. We parked the car a safe distance away and approached the cabin cautiously. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of our footsteps on the gravel. The door creaked loudly as Mark pushed it open, and we stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The cabin was empty, save for a few pieces of old furniture and a thick layer of dust. We split up and began searching for anything that might be useful. I was rifling through a stack of old papers when I heard Mark call out from the other room. "Over here," he said, his voice urgent. I rushed over and found him standing in front of a trapdoor in the floor. We pried it open and found a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. My heart pounded as we descended, our flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, we found a small, dimly lit room filled with filing cabinets and old computer equipment. It looked like a makeshift office, hastily abandoned. We started going through the files, and what we found was both horrifying and illuminating. The documents detailed the full extent of Operation Deep Eye. The surveillance was just the tip of the iceberg. The government had been conducting experiments on people for years, using advanced technology to manipulate and control them. They had files on every person they had taken, including those who had been erased. One file in particular caught my eye. It was labeled Subject 47 Inches Me. It detailed everything they had done to me, from the moment they started watching me to the experiments they had performed while I was unconscious. My blood ran cold as I read about their plans to recondition me, to turn me into a mindless puppet. Mark found similar files on himself and others, confirming our worst fears. But there was something else, evidence of a higher power pulling the strings. The documents mentioned a secret council of powerful individuals orchestrating everything from the shadows, ensuring their agenda was carried out. We knew we had to get this information out, but the challenge was how. As we were debating our next move, we heard the sound of vehicles approaching. Our hearts sank. They had found us. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice tight with fear. We grabbed as many files as we could and raced up the stairs. The cabin was surrounded by black SUVs, and armed men were pouring out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. There was no way out. "Go out the back," Mark said, shoving me towards a small window. "I'll hold them off." "No," We both go, I insisted, but he shook his head. There's no time. Get the information out. Expose them. He handed me a small flash drive. This has everything. Run. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded, tears streaming down my face. I climbed out the window and ran into the woods, the sound of gunfire and shouting behind me. My heart pounded in my ears as I stumbled through the darkness, branches scratching at my face and clothes. I ran for what felt like hours, not stopping until I was sure I had lost them. I found a small hidden cave and crawled inside, collapsing from exhaustion. My body was bruised and battered, my mind a whirlwind of fear and grief. I knew Mark was likely gone, but his sacrifice had given me a chance. Over the next few days, I made my way to the nearest town, staying off the main roads and avoiding people as much as possible. I found a public library and used one of the computers to upload the files to every major news outlet, social media platform, and conspiracy forum I could think of. I watched as the information spread like wildfire, the world reacting in shock and outrage. The government denied everything, of course, but the evidence was overwhelming. Protests erupted, investigations were launched, and the shadowy figures behind Operation Deep Eye were exposed. But I knew it wasn't over. I was still a fugitive, and they would never stop looking for me. I had to keep moving, keep hiding. The truth was out there, but the danger was far from gone. I changed my appearance, my name, everything. I disappeared into the shadows, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the day they would catch up to me. But no matter how afraid I was, I knew I had done the right thing. Mark's sacrifice had not been in vain. The world knew the truth, and people were fighting back. And as long as I was alive, I would continue to fight too, exposing the darkness lurking in the shadows, one step at a time.